Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Larry Clinton from the Internet Security Alliance. Larry, thanks for being on.
My pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. I'm excited to chat with you. For folks that don't know you as well as ISA, do you mind telling us a bit about your background and a bit about the organization as well?
Sure, appreciate it. So I have been with the Internet Security Alliance for 20 years. The Internet Security Alliance is a coalition of about 25 companies, major name organizations. We have representatives from all the critical industry sectors. And when I say all, I mean all. I mean, so we have the traditional, usual suspects, IT, telecom, defense, financial services, but we have agriculture, we have education, we have legal, media. So all these companies and their major name firms that are the Raytheons, the AIGs, the USAAs, the GEs of the world, and they all have basically the same problem. They're using more or less the same technology and being subject to the same kind of attacks. So even though they're in different lines of business, a lot of people have very similar approaches or issues that they're dealing in terms of cyber risk. The Internet Security Alliance is a little bit different than most organizations that deal with cybersecurity, in that our view is that the reason we're not making any progress in cybersecurity, and we are not making any progress in terms of cybersecurity, things are going from really bad to truly awful quickly. And we think one of the major reasons is that for the most part, the issue has been misanalyzed. People think, as we're going to discuss in a couple of minutes, that this is an IT issue, and it's got an IT component to it, but it's not an IT issue. And the people who are on my board tend to be the chief cybersecurity people from their organizations, most typically the chief information security officer. And so we're well aware of the technology, but the technology is just how the attacks occur. In order to solve the problem, we're going to need to get at why the attacks occur. And the reason the attacks occur is almost always economic. So what we really need to do is understand the economics of cybersecurity, and the economics of cybersecurity are all upside down. The attacks are cheap, easy to acquire, really profitable. The attackers have a great business model, whereas on the defender side, we're defending an inherently porous perimeter. We have no law enforcement. We prosecute less than 1% of cyber criminals. They always have first mover advantage, and we have to be successful 100% of the time. They only have to be successful 1% of the time. So all of the economic incentives are misaligned, and one of the things that we really need to do is reanalyze this issue and begin to approach it in a more comprehensive and strategic fashion. We have not been doing that. That's what the ISA is about, is establishing that new model for addressing cybersecurity so that we can begin to make progress in the area.
Yeah, I love it. I was smirking as you were saying some of that because, being a cyber practitioner for over 15 years, like it's all too familiar in terms of trying to cover such a massive attack surface and like trying to make the case for business to invest in cyber. You raised a lot of salient points. And the book you talked about here is actually what brought you guys to my attention, Cybersecurity for Business. It talks about cybersecurity not just being a business or not just being an IT issue. I'm sorry. So I want to lead with that. As a first question, why do you think traditionally cybersecurity has only been seen as an IT issue and not like a business risk issue per se?
So I think I get asked this question a lot actually, and it's a good question. My own view is that we were all unprepared for the digital age. I mean, this has just sort of happened to us. I mean, you're a little younger than I am, but like when I went to school, I went to the computer lab, and it was like as big as my house and was all mainframes and stuff like that. And then this whole evolution has occurred really in the last 25 or so years. We weren't prepared. We didn't see it. And one of the keys is it's so easy. I mean, I have a severely autistic son, who I'm very proud of, but candidly, he can't add 2 and 3. He's 31 years old, but he can download video. He can surf the web. This is a very user-friendly technology. And I think the assumption that everybody has is the technology is pretty easy. We can just fix this. And it's not true at all. I mean, as you know, it's really complicated stuff. So I think we have misanalyzed how easy this is going to be. And it is so seductive. I mean, over the last 20 years, virtually every organization in the world has remade their business model to capture the wonders of digitalization, be it um, distance marketing, remote employees, long international supply chains, cutting costs, all of these things. And so, the whole trend for 20, 30 years has been to maximize value using the technology, and we just haven't considered security. And so we're way behind on the security side of this. And people just think of it, well, it's, I guess all they have to do is download a patch, and we'll fix it. And people, I really don't even like the term patch because it makes it sound like there's a band-aid that you just kind of, slap over the problem. As you know, it's a lot more difficult than that, with some patching. So it's a much more difficult problem than in general we look at. And we just think of it incorrectly as just the technology. And those of us who are in the space know that's not the case. But we really need to kind of expand the learning curve for those who are not technologists, or not really working with it.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And, as we see like more and more of the blurring between business and like a digital economy, where now, technology is ubiquitous with delivering business value and, driving revenue, things like that. There's been a study by the World Economic Forum that says by the end of this year, actually 2022, 60% of GDP, global GDP, will be tied to digital platforms. With that reality in mind, do you think that more and more organizations are waking up to the reality that cybersecurity is tied to business value?
Yeah, I do think that there is definite movement in that direction. It is still the leading organizations, not the mainstream organizations. But for example, we at ISA do a lot of work with the National Association of Corporate Directors, which is the trade association that represents people who sit on corporate boards. And we have seen a really substantial reorientation to how leading boards of directors are dealing with cybersecurity, and they are increasingly moving it from the IT function and putting it into the board level, and viewing cybersecurity more from a strategic model. And this is some of the material that we go through in the book. In fact, the book that you mentioned is really based on the work that we've been doing with the NACD and, frankly, corporate board organizations around the world for the last 10 years. And so we are seeing this movement to understand cybersecurity in its broad, strategic, business-oriented perspective. And frankly, and this is another area we get into in the book, altering the structure of organizations so that we are restructuring how organizations look so that they are more sensitive to the digital era. So traditionally, for example, and up till really very recently, most organizations are structured more or less the same way they were structured after World War II. And you have a finance department, and you have a communications department, and you have an IT department, you have a legal department. But of course, cyber cuts across all these things. So what we are seeing in leading organizations is a movement towards a flatter organizational structure. And cyber risk is taken out of the province of the IT department as the lead, and weaving it in to an enterprise-wide risk management team. And that is a much more sensible approach to cybersecurity than the traditional approach. I mean, we have a saying, we're all familiar with, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so if you have the IT guys solely in charge of cybersecurity, all you're going to get is IT solutions. And IT solutions are important, obviously, but so are human resources solutions. I mean, we all know that the biggest vulnerability is the people. And so unless you have the human resources department woven into the cyber risk management plan, you're going to be missing, critical elements. Same thing with legal. Same thing even with public relations. I mean, any organization that has a major breach has a huge PR problem on their hands. If the PR people don't know what we're talking about and don't know how to manage talking about cyber in the general public, the organization has a major issue. So yes, we are seeing with leading organizations a move away from the traditional technocentric model of cybersecurity and up towards a broader team-oriented approach to cybersecurity, managed by the board or oversight by the board. It's not managed by the board. The board does oversight. Management team does the management, but doing it on a more enterprise-wide basis. And we think that's going to lead to greater effectiveness. But this is an emerging trend. This is not where we are in the mainstream.
Yeah, it's a gradual process that's underway right now in terms of maturing how we are structured organizationally. You said something that made me want to ask another question that I didn't really plan on asking in particular, but like, talk about changing organizational structures. There's always a contentious debate in the community among who the CISO should report to. Any thoughts around like CISO reporting relationships, that kind of thing in terms of organizational structure?
Yeah, we hear that there is an ongoing debate. You're absolutely right about this. Um, It really depends a lot. First of all, let me say I don't think that there is a one size fits all answer to this. Okay, it depends a lot on the organization and a lot on the surrounding components in the organization. Meaning, what sector are they in? What's their degree of regulation? What's their business model? All these things blend into it. And again, we do go into a number of models that address this in the book Cybersecurity for Business. I think what the core principle that seems to me to be best is to make sure that whoever is in charge of cyber risk, oversight, in charge of the whole team of cyber risk, first of all needs to have an enterprise-wide viewpoint. They can't be just the technologist. So, for example, many leading organizations are putting the chief risk officer or the chief operating officer or the chief financial officer in charge of that cyber risk team. And the CISO would be part of that team, would be a major part of that team, chief information security officer, who tends to be more on the technology side. And if we're talking about privacy, it tends to be a lawyer. So these are different jobs and very different people in different organizations. But I think the key is that you have the risk management team that includes the CISO and that they report up to somebody who has that enterprise-wide view. And in some small organizations, that could even be the CEO that the CISO and the team reports up to. What we're really trying to change here is the mindset. So, for example, the traditional way cybersecurity has been dealt with at a board meeting is at the end of the board meeting, we say, okay, now we're going to have the cybersecurity report, and the CISO or the CIO in the old days, comes up and they give a 10-minute report talking about vulnerabilities and and attacks and the number of attacks they repelled and a whole bunch of frankly largely meaningless statistics, sometimes designed to make the board's eyes glass over so they don't get questions. That's the wrong approach. Cybersecurity needs to be woven into the business model. So what we advocate in our work with the NACD and in the book is that cyber needs to be understood as part of the business. So cyber should be thought of in the same sense that we think of legal and finance. No business makes a important decision without talking to legal and finance. In the 21st century, it's legal, finance, and cyber, because cyber is involved in every significant business decision. And so you need the team reporting up through the entire organizational structure and being part of the business model as it moves forward. You can't just, if you're making a widget, you can't just slap the security on at the end. It's got to be in R&D, and the marketing people need to know how it's going to work so that they can handle it. So it's that team approach and that enterprise-wide perspective that really, I think, is the most important thing. How it works in any individual company, as I say, largely depends on the structure of that company.
Yeah, that makes sense. Depending on the size of that company, the industry, all those kind of things are going to factor in. You said a couple things that I thought were funny. I work a lot in application security and DevSecOps and things like that, recently. And there's always the big push for shifting security left, build in, bake in versus bolt on. And you talked about the same kind of concept, except from an organizational perspective, rather than like a software development perspective.
Right.
So it's so funny to see that paradigm here at play too. And also, you talked about a couple other roles that you mentioned as well. And I think we're starting to see like organizations like Carnegie Mellon have some great programs for chief risk officer, or, those kind of roles are starting to evolve. And I've even seen a chief resiliency officer, which I thought was kind of neat at a large financial institution. So I think it's really cool. We're starting to see the evolution of, cybersecurity and security in general within the business. One thing I wanted to ask about as well is, you talked about industry trends and how it's an effort to get us matured in that direction. We have seen some efforts recently by the SEC to require organizations that are publicly traded to disclose, cybersecurity expertise among the board and the board makeup. Any thoughts around that change and the impact it might have?
Well, yes, we have quite a lot of thoughts about what the SEC has issued in their notice of proposed rulemaking, and my information on that is, in terms of prognosis, is that the commission is taking a good deal of time to consider that, and that's a good thing. So in the notice of proposed rulemaking, the commission actually cited the ISA NACD handbook, I think 7 times. So they are really looking at this from our perspective. In short, we are pretty concerned about the proposed rule that the SEC is putting out. We have commented to the commission, and we've met with the commission to explain these things, and we think they are considering them carefully. But the sort of what the commission wants to do, the purported goal of the SEC action, is to better inform investors so that investors can make better decisions about stock when stock purchases, and be able to manage their portfolio, which of course is great. However, the sort of information that the SEC is suggesting would need to be disclosed publicly is security information. They want to know security practices and strategies, procedures. It is very doubtful that an investor is going to be able to analyze that kind of material and understand what it means in terms of an investment. It is very likely that an attacker could look at that material and understand how to better formulate an attack. So while we support the idea of investors having appropriate information with regard to making their investment decisions, obviously, we want to be very, very careful that we are not making this problem worse by giving information to the attacker. We have proposed to the commission an alternative, couple of alternatives. So there is information that we could disclose that probably would be helpful for an investor. For example, cost. How much is an organization spending on its security? That's a pretty good measure, and something that would be easily understood by an investor to see whether or not the organization is really serious about cyber protection or not. So that would be a good thing to be disclosed, and something that is not going to help the attacker, but would help the investor. Another suggestion we have been making is that whatever the commission mandates, and they have the ability to mandate this, across all publicly traded companies, whatever they mandate probably ought to be something that we know would work. For example, I've mentioned the National Association of Corporate Directors, ISA, Cyber Risk Handbook. The principles and practices that we have identified in that handbook, which is available, by the way, free of charge to anybody who wants to get it from NACD or ISA or DHS, frankly, who's endorsed it. The principles and practices in that handbook are one of the few sets of best practices, in fact, I think the only set of best practices I'm aware of, that has actually been independently assessed and found that it actually works. So PwC, which had nothing to do with the handbook, did an independent assessment of the handbook and found that organizations that use those principles have better cyber risk management, have closer alignment of cybersecurity with their overall business goals, have better budgeting with regard to cybersecurity, and have a better culture of security. So, another thing that the commission could better recommend is that organizations disclose the degree to which they follow these empirically demonstrated successful best practices. That again would be something that would be useful for the investor and not dangerous in terms of tipping our hand to the attack community, which of course is very, very sophisticated. Chris, let me say one last thing about the SEC. And we think they're well-intentioned people, and we want to help them. And our filing is fairly voluminous and is available for anybody who wants to read it. One of the ironies of the SEC's proposal is that it would help facilitate stock manipulation. So we already know, in fact, the commission's own notice says very specifically that we already know that breaches do not cause stock prices to go down, or at least not permanently. There'll be a short-term dip, but it's the bad publicity, not the breach, that causes the stocks to dip. As a result, what the commission's notice could do would be to trigger public awareness of these things, and so an attacker could actually time the breach and short the stock, so that there would actually be a facility for increasing stock manipulation by following what the SEC is doing. So that's a elongated answer. As I said, we have a lot of concerns about this. We made a very extensive filing, but the short form is, sure, we can find things that businesses could disclose to better inform investors without endangering ourselves more significantly with respect to this activity. So
yeah, it's a super fascinating answer in the sense of like the convergence of digital data breaches, but cyber stock or stock manipulations as well. So it's really interesting to think about that side of things. And then you also touched on like the ever present kind of argument of security through obscurity, like how much information should we disclose, how much will be beneficial for an attacker to use and try to manipulate, like what's the level of transparency that would let us be transparent but not give away too much information that could actually hurt us as well. So really fascinating answer there. I wanted to ask this, and it's kind of been self-evident throughout the conversation already, but how, maybe we can foot stomp or emphasize here, but how important do you think cybersecurity is for businesses competing in the new digital economy of today?
Absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. By the way, Chris, I apologize. This is my autistic son walking around behind us.
I can hear you just fine. Don't worry about it.
Terrific. So digital transformation is fundamentally critical to compete in the modern market. You simply cannot compete unless you access many of the technologies and best practices ranging from cloud solutions through use of international supply chains, and you just can't compete without these kinds of things. But what businesses need to understand is, although the imperative to transform digitally from a business point of view is fundamental, it also undermines security. So what the key to running a successful business in this sense in the modern era is creating that balance, balancing the amount of risk that you can afford to take against the business process that you're going to achieve. The good news there is that over the past several years, there has been an evolution in risk assessment methodologies. How do you do a sophisticated risk assessment? The traditional way, of course, of doing cyber risk assessments is a checklist. And if you're in financial service, for example, the checklist is like hundreds of items long. And there's never been any correlation made between checking off the number of items and actually enhancing security. In fact, there's research that's done some really good, a great book, a fellow named Douglas Hubbard came out with how to measure anything in cybersecurity. And he did a review of the literature and found none of these ordinal measurements that the regulators mandate us has ever been shown to actually enhance security. But that's the old way. I mean, back, 15, 20 years ago, that's all we had was these checklists. But things have changed now. So there's X analytics, there's security Q, there's factor analysis of information risk. There's a variety of methodologies out there now that will enable an organization to assess their cyber risk from an empirical and economic perspective. And so we now have the capability to kind of assess what is the organization's appropriate cyber risk appetite based on a serious methodological analysis of the issue. And so that you can then calibrate what sort of mitigation or transfer devices for your cyber risk you can implement that will bring your risk down to an acceptable economic level. That's where we need to be going. And we now can move in that direction. We have not been there traditionally, but that's what an organization really needs to do so that it can understand its cyber risk in empirical and economic terms. If we can do that, we can begin to more appropriately target our cyber spending, which is really, really important because, as I said, we deal a lot with corporate boards, and frankly, there is some exhaustion occurring within the board community with respect to cybersecurity. I mean, people are going to their boards and the board saying, look, we're not going to increase your budget 20% every single year. You need to be telling us what we need to do less of, what we need to do more of. The only way to do that is to utilize one of these more sophisticated cyber risk assessment models that are out there. And some of them are available, open source. Others are proprietary. Again, you need to calibrate them to your business needs and structure, et cetera, business model. But there is, we are able to do this now better than we have been traditionally. Unfortunately, by the way, our regulatory friends in the government have really not caught on very much to this. So we need to kind of push in that direction.
Yeah. I've spent a lot of my career in the public sector, whether on the defense side or federal like agency side of things. So, they tend to be behind sometimes. So that's not surprising. And you brought up, some great resources there. The Measuring Cybersecurity Risk, book by Doug Hubbard and Richard Searson, definitely a classic that people should read, much to the dismay of maybe my fellow cyber peers who are not mathematicians like me. But I do agree it's the way we need to go as an industry. And there's some great resources out there like FAIR and others that people can take advantage because it's going to be hard to articulate, budget increases and funding for initiatives if you can't really tie it to quantified business risk. And I think that's where we're going as we're starting to mature as an industry and move in that direction. So another question I wanted to ask, and it kind of builds on what you just said there is, for cybersecurity professionals communicating with their business peers, any recommendations of how to get the message across more effectively? You talked about, kind of eyes glossing over and, just throwing random numbers at people and metrics that they don't understand. Any recommendations how to communicate to the business, when it comes to cybersecurity risk?
Yeah, a couple. So first of all, pardon me, we would recommend that when people who are in charge of cyber risk, and they may be the technologists, that is traditionally the case, they really need to be candid with their superiors. It is an open secret in the community that there is a strategy that has been used many times, which is throw a bunch of stuff at them so they won't understand, so that we intimidate them from asking any questions, because frankly, we don't want them messing in our business. I understand that strategy. I do not embrace that strategy. I think we need to find a way to enhance the communication and really develop an enterprise-wide understanding of these issues. Before I give the other thing, I do want to say, it is the role of the management team to be in charge of cyber risk management. The role of the board is not to be in charge of cyber risk management. They are in charge of cyber risk oversight. That's a different thing. And board needs to stay within its lane, and management needs to stay within its lane. But so candor, I think, is one thing. The second thing that I would urge is that the cyber risk management team needs to talk in business language. So the initial approach that was taken in this space was, okay, let's teach the board about technology. Let's tell them all about ISO standards and NIST frameworks, and vulnerabilities, and all this kind of stuff, and not going to work. What we find works more is to embed cybersecurity within the business. The business people understand the business. They need to understand how cyber fits into the business. So, for example, every merger and acquisition has an enormous cybersecurity component to it. So the board needs to hear from the technologists, what is the business implications of doing a merger where you're jamming together two enormous, probably divergent, complicated information systems. What does that mean in terms of expanding our exposure? When we're innovating a new product and we're launching a new supply line, what does that mean in terms of security? And again, we kind of get back to these models, because these models help us do that, so that at the end of the day, we can present this information to the management team, the senior management team, or the board, whoever the target is in this particular case, so that they understand where this fits in terms of what they are trying to accomplish. So that there are 5 principles in the NACD handbook. The last 2 are that the management team needs to report to the board the cyber risk framework, both in terms of the technical framework, what standards, what frameworks, NIST or whatever they're using, and also the organizational framework, which we discussed before. And then the next thing is that, based on this sophisticated risk assessment, what are the risks that we will accept? Are we going to do business in China or not? What are the risks we're going to avoid? What are the risks that we can mitigate? How do we mitigate those down? And what ones do we transfer? If we can put things in those clear business terms, we'll have a much better communication. And some of these models that we were talking about before do this. The FAIR model, which you mentioned in particular, advocates the use of Monte Carlo simulations, so that you can run a series of simulations, and you can explain this to the board. They don't need to understand how the simulation worked. They need to understand what came out of the simulation, and that is the sort of thing that they can understand. So we think that you can really talk. You need to be candid. You should be business oriented. You should be empirical to the extent that you can be. It needs to be based on fact, or at least the best fact that we can determine. I mean, these are all estimates. These are all probabilities, and there are a series of qualifications that need to be brought to the risk management team. And it's more than technology. They need to have comfort with numbers. They need to understand the business. They need to understand basic probability. With greater communication, we can probably establish some of those things. But a clear, candid, empirically based, business oriented presentation, I think, is really what you're looking for.
Yeah, I think those are really excellent recommendations. Tying to the business, getting away from the age-old FUD approach of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and actually being pragmatic and realistic with them, and tying it to the business and the outcomes, and tying it to actual empirical data, as you said. Really great recommendations. So one last question I have for you that I ask of every guest is, what does the term cyber resiliency mean to you?
Well, first of all, I distinguish between cyber resiliency and cyber security. So, for example, if we think of supply chains, one of the best ways to have a resilient supply chain is to have redundancy. You have multiple supply chains, so if one goes down, you use the other one. So that enhances resiliency, but it undermines security, because now you've got multiple places to attack on multiple different supply chains. So there's a difference between resiliency and security is the first thing. I think what we are looking for is a system that can be sustainable. We want a sustainable model of security. If we're thinking of this from a business point of view, we need to understand that we have to have adequate security so that we retain profitability and growth. Now, by the way, it's a very different definition if we look at it from the government point of view. So one of the insights that currently exists in the existing National Infrastructure Protection Plan is that businesses and governments assess risk, resiliency, on an aligned but not identical fashion. So so if we're talking about resiliency from a national perspective, keeping our nation resilient from a cyber perspective, we need to understand that the public sector and private sector are going to analyze that very differently. On the private sector side, it's essentially an economic question. What security comes down to, resiliency comes down to, is how much can I afford to buy? And for many businesses, especially small businesses, it's where do I spend that one marginal dollar on security? Because the marketing people and the research people, they want that dollar too. So we have to figure that out. On the government side, they are much less risk tolerant than the private sector is, because they've got other responsibilities like national security and privacy and elections and social safety nets. They've got a lot of things run that are not economically determined, unlike business. The reason I raise this is because in the cyber perspective, we have both industry and government using the same system. And that system is being secured, for the most part, by the private sector with this much less risk tolerant, with this much more risk tolerant perspective, this purely economic. So we actually have a gap between funding cybersecurity at the commercial level and cybersecurity needs at a national level, because, of course, we're under nation state attack on our critical infrastructure. So if we're going to build a resilient overall system, if that's where your question is going, we need to find a way to bring those things together. We need to find a way for businesses to be making cyber investments at a national security level, even though it is not justified by their business model. That's a real hard problem. So when I think of resiliency, that's the construct that I am using, is how do we bring together these two, not really competing, but different models for doing cyber risk assessments so that we can make the entire system secure. So I mentioned before that in the NACD documents, we have 5 principles. We have those same 5 principles for nearly 10 years. This past year, working with the World Economic Forum, we added a 6th. And that 6th is an organization needs to be viewing cyber risk from the ecosystem perspective, not from the entity perspective. So a board of directors needs not only to say, how are we securing our company? They need to be, how are we securing the full system? And we need to take that ecosystem security issue up to our government partners and collectively design a system that will be resilient in the long term, bringing these two different perspectives together. So that may be a different sense of resiliency than you were thinking of, but that's kind of what we're thinking.
Yeah, no, it typically people answer the question from like a single system or a single organizational view, and you looked at it from a broader ecosystem view in terms of bridging the divide between public and private sector and the ubiquitous use of technology between the two. And I talked about earlier, like how gross domestic product is tied to these digital platforms. That impacts commercial and public sector. So that was a really, really awesome answer. So I really appreciate that unique perspective. So I did want to say, one more chance to plug the book. This is what, brought Larry to my attention here, Cybersecurity for Business by ISA. But that said, for folks that beyond getting the book and going to give that a read and take away some of the great points from there, any other resources you want to recommend? And then where can people, follow you, follow ISA, and keep up with, the content you guys are putting out there?
So thank you, first of all, for this opportunity, Chris. Really appreciate it. In terms of other resources, we do point to the National Association of Corporate Directors Handbook, Cyber Risk Oversight Handbook. We're currently going through our 4th edition of that. That is, I think, the only private sector produced document that is actually endorsed by DHS and DOJ. It has that set of core principles. It's a comparatively short document, less than 100 pages. So it is really applicable to even smaller businesses. I mean, a lot of times when we get into the cyber space, we're dealing with things like that book that you held up, which we appreciate, but it's a couple hundred pages, and it talks about some pretty sophisticated things. Chapter 4 deals with some of these models, and it gets a little heavy. The stuff in there on audits and mergers and acquisitions get a little heavy. But if you go to the risk oversight handbooks, it's a lot simpler approach, and I think that's a good place for people to start. Is what are the basic principles that an organization needs to follow? And as I say, we have 5 now, 6 of these principles, and then there's a set of toolkits in the back, which are really the questions that you should be asking as you deal with these things. So, not everybody who runs a business is going to have a major cyber risk team. We don't, frankly, have enough people for a major for everybody to have a cyber risk team. We're really short on qualified personnel, but at least know what the questions are to ask. And so I think the NACD ISA document probably is a simpler and free version of that kind of material. We obviously, for the more sophisticated practitioner, we think that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and DHS CISA has really come a long way in the last couple of years, and they are now putting out much more timely information. I think more in terms of practices and the like than actual information sharing, technical information sharing. For the technical information sharing, obviously people should be part of their ISAC or their ISO, their information sharing organization, or their information sharing council. And also, organizations probably should be aligning themselves with their sector coordinating councils. We need to have a lot more sharing of information, not just technical information, but best practice information, threat information. And I think some of these broader organizations really are helpful in that regard. As I say, the 6th principle that we added when we worked with the forum this past year, and we're going to put it into the next edition of the document we'll do with NACD, adds that new principle of looking at cyber risk, not just from the entity perspective, but from the systemic perspective, and understanding that we really, you can't build a war, you can't build a digital war around your company. You're interrelated, interconnected with sometimes thousands of other entities. We need to work on that kind of collective security model. So joining those organizations, participating in those organizations, and then accessing some of this other material. And as we mentioned before, the Hubbard book, the FAIR model, the X Analytics model. There's a variety of these things that are out there that people really need to attend to. The one last thing that I would say, and again, ISA does about half its work with the government, half with the private sector. We've been talking really about the private sector this morning. But an important principle that we do make in the book, but really needs to be emphasized, is that there is a difference between regulatory compliance and security. Compliance is not security. You can be, many organizations are fully compliant. Target was fully compliant with some pretty good requirements, and they were completely insecure. So the notion that all I need to do is be in compliance with regulations that are proposed, that's important, but that's not going to enhance security. So security needs to be done on an individual basis and then broadened out, to an ecosystem. So we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I was going to try to recap your kind of final summary there, but you had so many great points. I can't possibly summarize them all, but those were really great takeaways. I did want to emphasize the NACD handbook, an ISA handbook. I shared that. I want to say it came out in 2020 or 2021. Definitely an amazing resource for people to dig into. Definitely want to foot stomp the guidance coming out by CISA. They've had some great resources around zero trust. They've had some great resources around software supply chain, SBOM, and then also their vulnerability list that they've been putting out for exploited vulnerabilities. Keep an eye on that. And overarching, message you gave there again is, partnership between the public and private sector and the broader systemic risk that we all operate in from a digital perspective. So that said, Larry, thanks so much for being on, and thanks for everyone tuning in.
Great pleasure, Chris. Appreciate you having me.